everyone, and welcome to today's interview. This is part of a series that we're doing with Guided Path on different paths to education. And today I'm very honored and pleased to have with me as our guest, Edward Fiske. Edward is the author of the infamous or famous Fiske Guide. It's the college guide that we all use. So welcome, Ted.
Glad to be here.
So I want to show everybody the cover. So the newest version is going to be coming out next month. So we've got the cover. People haven't even seen this yet. Hopefully you can see this. And it's going to be coming out in July so that you can purchase this and have this available as you work with your students in this year's rising class. So Tad, we're so glad that you had the inspiration to write this book and have been writing this for how many years, did you tell me?
I hate to think of it, it's coming up on 35 years. The first edition was in 1981. I missed a couple of years when it wasn't annual, but basically there have been about 30 or 33 editions so far.
I think that's phenomenal. So what inspired you to write that first Fiske Guide?
Well, let's go back to the late 70s, early 80s. I was the education editor of the New York Times at the time. And you recall that in the late 70s and early 80s, the last of the baby boomers were working their way through college, and high school graduation rates were declining. And some colleges were getting very nervous about filling up their classes, and so they became rather aggressive in their marketing. Now, in retrospect, it all looks kind of quaint. It was overstuffed mailboxes with 4-color brochures and videotapes. Remember them, and that sort of thing. But they also did a lot of really crazy promotional things. And I wrote the story about this for the front page of the New York Times. I subsequently did it for the business section and other places. I did an article for Atlantic Monthly, that was, as it was then called. And after these articles appeared, the head of Times Books, which was then published by the New York Times, it was a book publishing arm of the paper, said, we got to come in, get somebody to come in on the side of the consumer to help cut through all the propaganda that's coming from the colleges. And so that's how the Fiske Guide was born. It started out as a New York Times guide to colleges, but it got to be pretty controversial. And I was saying things in the book that I couldn't say in the newspaper. You wouldn't say, well, some people say the food in the cafeteria is terrible, others like it. It just didn't work. So Punch Sulzberger, the publisher, said, I think we got to take our name out of this, but you can have the book. So eventually it became the Fiske Guide to Colleges.
Oh, interesting. So how did you end up being the Times reporter on education? Was that something that you had an interest in, or how did you end up in that position?
Well, I did. I actually started out, I have a graduate degree in theology, and I started out as a religion reporter and then the religion editor. And I've been doing that for about 10 years. And it was a great job. It was post-Vatican II and all the rise of all the cults and sects and so forth. But I've been doing that for a while, and I was looking for a different assignment. I was actually expecting to go on to the foreign staff, but at that point they called me in and said, we need an education editor. And I guess what qualified me was that in covering religion, I got to be very adept at interviewing people who held firmly to dogmatic beliefs. So they said, hey, you can deal with the educators and the policy makers. So I became the education editor.
Oh, that's wonderful. So as you look back and, you've seen all these different trends from the 70s on, what trend stands out the most to you?
Well, I can answer that question in a number of ways, but I think in terms of let's say in a narrow sense, the sort of the content of the book, when the book first started out, we were kind of flippant about drinking on campuses, and we've become a lot more serious about dealing with alcohol policies and things like that. So we, somewhat more sober age, to not too much metaphors, but there's been a lot more attention, or there was a period, especially in the 90s, when there was a lot of concern about campus safety. So we started talking about that. More recently, there's been issues of sexual assault. So we've started asking, we send out questionnaires to the colleges and the students, and that's how we get our information. But so we've started adding questions about sexual assault policies and that sort of thing. I think there's some fairly continuous themes, and I have a fairly well thought through, at least I think, set of values that I try to build into the guide. One was the respect for diversity. So I've always asked questions in write-ups on the guides, talk about the diversity. And initially it was pretty much racial, but in recent years, there's been a huge emphasis on socioeconomic diversity. And so we now include in the write-ups what the proportion of Pell Grant recipients is in the student body. And we really talk a lot more about the value of diversity. And then I think the other thing it would be a global perspective. I mean, from very early on, I started including some Canadian colleges, but then I included the four historic Scottish universities. We added Trinity College Dublin recently. We may be looking to add maybe some continental European institutions, or Australia maybe. But it's also, I've seen the big increase in the number of undergraduates who study abroad. And so this whole idea of a global perspective has really crept into almost all of the write-ups within the last 5 years. But that's something we've always had an interest in, and I've always valued. As I said, at one point I was expecting to be a foreign correspondent. But it's just one of the defining trends right now.
So what influences the choices of which colleges go into the Fiske guide?
There are a lot of colleges which would like to know the precise answer to that. We're limited. We've got 325 plus schools, which is about 15% of the talking about 4-year undergraduate programs. Some in research universities with graduate programs, but basically we can only cover about 15% of the schools. The first cut would be, what are the schools that people really want to know about? Which are the top schools academically and in terms of reputation? That probably accounts for maybe half of the schools. But then we look for diversity of various kinds. We want a good balance. We want to make sure we have most of the major state flagship universities. We can't do a lot of the regional universities, the Western Michigan or the Eastern Michigan or those, because it's just space. We look for geographic diversity, which means that a liberal arts college in Texas is going to have a much better chance of being in it than a comparable institution in Massachusetts. I look for particular niches and particular types of schools. We have evangelical schools, historically Black schools that emphasize environmental studies. So there's some niches like that I try to make sure that for anybody who is looking for that type, there may be at least 3 or 4 schools that might meet their needs. So we look for geographic diversity, but then also diversity of mission. And then, frankly, it's a journalistic enterprise. The method's very simple. I ask students what it's like to be a student at their school and write down what they say. It's very simple. So there's schools that I include that might not otherwise make the cut, but they're just fun to write about. I mean, Deep Springs in California is the only 2-year college, and you just they get out. Well, now it's may or may not be going. co-ed. But then College of the Atlantic up in Bar Harbor, Maine, it's only got about 400 students. All they do is study human ecology. And it's marginal in the great sweep of American higher education, but it's fun to write about. And this year, Antioch, of course, closed. Mm-hmm. That school is really fun to write about because of it originated the co-op education years ago, and it's got a very distinct personality. So we're going to probably add that back. They're now coming back to life, and they're struggling, but it's fun to read about. So I want the book to be entertaining.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that makes total sense. What about new programs as they come on? Like I'm thinking of Quest College in Canada, or we just did an interview on Minerva Project. So they're breaking trends in education as well.
Well, I try to keep up with. Well, I ask the schools, what are their biggest majors and what are their new majors, so like brain sciences, that's cognitive science is huge issue now. And I think at Wellesley, it's the second biggest major. So there are trends like that, and we keep up with the with the new programs and new buildings and that. But the main thing that I try to do is to describe the institutional personality, the institutional character of the schools. And when I first set out to do this, there was a huge editorial risk that once you'd written about the 17th small liberal arts college in Ohio, where the faculty often invite the students to their home sport dinner, it would they'd all look alike. And it would be really dull to read about. Nobody would want it. Turned out that was not a problem at all. That schools that maybe 10 miles down the road from each other and look very similar, they all have their own particular histories, traditions, quirks, their institutional personality, their institutional culture. So that's what I really try to. The emphasis in the book is to capture that unique institutional culture that makes that college different from other schools that may be competing in its same niche. And that institutional culture persists pretty much from year to year. I mean, occasionally when some of the former women's colleges started accepting men, you would think that'd be a big cultural shift. Well, actually, it turns out that the men that go to Vassar, other than in some obvious respects, aren't all that different from the kind of women who were going to Vassar before when it was an all-women's college. So, and that I found to be really fascinating. There are a couple of exceptions where the culture has evolved. For example, in the 80s and 90s, Syracuse was a pretty miserable place to be as an undergraduate. All the priority was undergraduate and professional programs. That's where their communications school. That was where they saw their institutional niche. Especially, they made a conscious decision about 15 years ago to get serious about undergraduates. So now Syracuse is a pretty good place to be an undergraduate, and especially if you're low income. Come from low income. So they really pushed. Nancy Cantor, when she was president, has pushed socioeconomic diversity. So that would be an example of a school that where it did change the culture, at least from the point of undergraduates, which is all I'm writing about anyway. Yeah, but by and large, the culture persists. And occasionally colleges will try to, like a college with a religious tradition will try to become very job-oriented, It never works. They have to, you can evolve, but you've got to keep yourself rooted in your particular history and traditions. Otherwise, it just won't work. That's fun to write about.
It is, and it's interesting, and it shows the different trends and how even though some things change, like they go from single to co-ed, I think about the two colleges both my husband and myself went to. I went to a women's college for a while, and my husband went to a men's, and they both are now co-ed. But when we go back, I hadn't really thought about it, but you're right. The culture and the character of the schools is still the same, even though they're now co-ed.
Yeah. The most dramatic example that I came across on this had to do, I'll indulge you for just a minute, the University of Pennsylvania. And I grew up in Philadelphia, and even though I wasn't aware of this, but the liberal arts tradition at Penn is fairly recent. It's really post-World War II. And when we were reading through the student questionnaires for the first edition of what became the Fiske from Penn, there was an unmistakable undercurrent of anti-intellectualism in these questionnaires. I thought, this is an Ivy League school. What in the world is going on? So I put the write-up aside and started interviewing. I interviewed Vartan Gregorian, who a lot of people know, who's been the provost. There's a guy named Digby Baltzell, wonderful name, who wrote a history of how the Philadelphia and Boston aristocracies dealt very differently with their university. And what I discovered was that, as I said, the liberal arts tradition is pretty much post-World War II at Penn. But over the years, over 2 centuries, Penn made its reputation. It was the first psychological clinic, the business school, dental school, medical school. It was the sort of professions, yeah. And then the liberal arts was kind of added to that. And what I discovered was, and this is a remarkable point, it all basically can be traced to the values of Benjamin Franklin, who founded the University of Pennsylvania. And he was a genius, but he was a pragmatist, lightning and the post office and all the things that he did. And for Franklin, who was obviously very bright, knowledge was first and foremost something to be used and embraced practically. It wasn't so much an end in itself. So this followed, can be traced all the way up to the current period, this emphasis on the pragmatic as well as the intellectual side of ideas, that Penn today is still a leader in service learning and service research, So the idea, so that it made sense maybe picking up these anti-intellectual strains from the questionnaires, but the notion that the values of some guy who died over 200 years ago were still showing up unprompted in the open-ended answers to questions in 1981 was just mind-blowing. So it was a good example of how the traditions really do persist.
That's
yeah, it was weird.
That's
weird.
Amazing. It's inspiring to have that kind of have somebody who has communicated and have that vision being able to carry forward through so many generations.
Yeah, and it's something that's been nurtured and built upon. Judith Rodin, when she was a few presidents ago at Penn, in her inaugural address, talked about this, about how these values of Benjamin Franklin and his attitude toward knowledge and scholarship and all were something that they continued to build on. So anyway, American colleges and universities they're a diverse group, and it's a lot of fun.
Well, and what's interesting for our whole country, and especially our whole education system, it is, compared to other systems in the world, it's relatively young. I mean, you've got other institutions that have thousands of years, and we have hundreds. So our audience is counselors, advisors, people working with students. What can we learn from these past trends and patterns that you've seen? What advice would you give to counselors and advisors?
I guess a couple of things. We've talked a little bit about the values. I mean, I think the evolution. Oops, it says my connection is unstable. Can you hear me all right?
I can, yes.
Yeah, okay. I'm sorry. I'm getting funny little messages. I mean, as I said, I really the diversity of American higher educations is its really singular characteristic. In Europe, you tend to go to the big university in the nearest city, whereas in the United States, partly because the earliest colleges were started by religious denominations, and they wanted their own little college outside of an urban area. So we have a very different history in the way our institutions have evolved. But the idea that there is this incredible diversity. There are literally dozens of schools that would be a good fit, and counselors all know the word fit. Yeah, that would be a good fit for any kid, and so that's one of the things I really try to when talking to high school kids. You've got a lot of choices out there, and you got to do some thinking about what's going to meet your needs. But then there are lots of schools out there, and it's just a question of trying to find that fit. And what I hope, one of the things that I really, the compliment I most appreciate hearing is when somebody comes up and says, I went to this school, and frankly, I never even heard of it till I ran across it in the Fiske guide, and now I'm here and I'm having a great time. So I think that this idea of the diversity and the fact that there are lots of good schools out there for any kid is a real strength of American higher education.
Oh, I agree. And that's our job as counselors and advisors. And I know especially on an international, that working with students from an international perspective has really exploded over the last few years. And being able to communicate that not only to American audiences, but to international audiences, like in China and India and Asian countries and other countries, is often a challenge that counselors, advisors are.
Simply the language. In most parts of the word college means high school.
Mm-hmm.
So you have some basic, misunderstandings that you got to clear up.
Yes, definitely. So what do you see as trends for the future based on these experiences and where we've been? What do you see as a trend in the future, Ted?
Well, yeah, that's another whole program. I think one of the big problems is the cost, and that seems to be getting worse, not better. So that's a huge problem. And the closely related problem is the whole question of socioeconomic diversity, and the college going pool from now on is going to be very different from what it was in the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s. That especially the small liberal arts colleges presumed was going to be their base. Well, that core of upper middle class students who can often fairly racially imbalanced, that's just not going to be there. And colleges have to figure out how can we serve financially but also academically. How can we adjust so that we're going to serve this very different constituency? And that to me is the overriding challenge, and they're not getting much help from state legislators. That's a big problem. But there are ways to do it. The colleges that have done this, Vassar does a good job. Syracuse did that. Nancy Cantor's now at Rutgers. They're doing a good job. Amherst, of all places, a really top elite school that has a very good program in promoting socioeconomic diversity. So I think that's yeah. And then state universities have the same issue, but in very different ways.
I agree with you. And we hear a lot of articles and people talking about student debt and how that is, probably the next bubble to burst, just like the housing bubble in the, early 2000s.
Yeah.
And, being prepared for that. And that's talking about fit, having college affordability should be part of that fit. Whereas before,
they're very interlocking issues. So So I think that's I mean, the other thing that one of the values that I've also built into the guide from the very beginning is the value of the liberal arts.
Mm-hmm.
And we could there are lots of graduation speeches about the importance of liberal arts and all, but as I see it, as you look at the way the job market is changing, the liberal arts, far from disappearing, are now more central than ever.
Mm-hmm.
Learning to think, learning to solve problems, learning to communicate answers, learning to put things in historical perspective. Because nobody's going to, 10 years out, most graduates will probably have had 2 or 3 jobs, maybe be in 2 or 3 different industries. So there's no real practical knowledge that you can get, or at least narrow knowledge that you can get that's going to last you very long. What you can learn is learn how to think and problem solve, and this is what the liberal arts has always been about. And it's frustrating, especially when you talk to state legislators who just don't understand this. So anyway, I think I expect to see the liberal arts, persist and thrive, because it's ultimately that's the most practical. Ironically, that's the most practical kind of education you can get.
Absolutely, because there are jobs that our students will have that haven't even been invented yet. Who would have known there was a social media director, even 10 years ago, and now that's such a big area. So being able to prepare to be able to think and be versatile, will help our students. So
I have a bumper sticker on my car. It says "Creative Thinking: The Other National Deficit." I get into a lot of conversations in parking lots.
I bet you do. I bet you do. So we have a question. We have a couple of questions as we finish our time together. But Barbara asked about you have in the book, and I think one of the things that really sets it apart is you have the rating section. And you have a quality of life, a social quality, social life. Can you explain a little bit about what that means, how those ratings are derived, and how you would recommend counselors use those sections?
Yeah, I mean, everybody, I assume, understands. I don't rank schools the way another publication, whose name shall not be mentioned, does. Because first of all, it's dishonest. It's just there's the difference between number 23 and number 17 is ridiculous, and it asks the wrong question. It's not what's the best college, it's what's the best college for you. So the original concept was in order to differentiate schools a little bit and help people maybe look for similar schools with similar patterns, was the model of the restaurant critic. It goes back. This is a journalistic enterprise. I ask people what's going on at the school, write down what they say. And so students may figure, well, they're capable of getting a student into a college that's going to have 4, 4.5, 5 stars academically. And so then it's just a way to help you work your way through. There's nothing particularly scientific about the rankings. What I say is anybody the rankings are the ratings are basically a shorthand of what's in the write-ups. I mean, it's these narrative write-ups describing the culture. So you could probably come up with exactly or pretty close to the same kind of ratings just on your own, just by the content of the write-up. So it's kind of a shorthand. If you are looking for a school that's got a lot of party, the social, look for one that's got a heavy on social life. And so it's just a crude way to maybe help you work your way through the book.
Well, and I think from a student and also from a parent perspective, it gives them a starting point to look and be able to start digging into the college a little bit more. And well, this has 3 stars or 4 stars, you know, what makes it a 3-star or 4-star, and really go into the descriptions and some of the other data.
Yeah, you can't take the numbers too seriously. And for one thing, it's, yeah, and you're going back to what's going to be a place that's going to accommodate a particular student's needs. But so I'm just trying to be helpful, but don't read an awful lot into it. You know.
So that's great advice for us as counselors and advisors, is to communicate and share for our students. So, well, thank you. This has been most enlightening. It's just been delightful to talk to you.
Thanks to all, and good luck with all your charges and in your counseling activities.
We're all getting ready and gearing up for this summer and getting our students ready. So we're all going to be looking for this book as it comes out. And also, just so people know, we also have the guided, in Guided Path, we have the Fiske guide. So it comes out in book form in July, and then in October or so, we have it available in Guided Path too.
Yeah, and there's an online version of it, and there's an interactive one for.
Yeah, there's an interactive one on your iPad, and I've used that with students too. So, you know, embracing technology, we want to do that as well. So, well, you enjoy your summer, enjoy the other avocations and conferences and things that I know you're going to be involved with. And
I'll come back speaking fluent German, I'm sure.
Yeah, but it'll be barren German. I also want to remind everyone we have another interview at the end of the month, June 28th. It's going to be with Chris Anderson. He is with the NYU Tisch School of Performing Arts, and he is going to be talking with us about choosing the right path as a visual performing arts student. This is June 28th. It'll be 10 a.m. Pacific time, 1 p.m. Eastern time. Registration is open for that, so we want to invite you to participate in that as well. And thank you again, Ted. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
You take care.